Good morning, everybody. We've got another busy day in artificial intelligence news. Before we start, I want to just say that I'm going to try a slightly different approach. So lately on these, I've been doing basically a single topic and then unpacking it. But today I'm going to try and cover a couple of different things. So just bear with me as I get on the horse for this new format. All right, so first we're going to cover briefly Gavin Newsom vetoing Senate Bill 1047. So that's California's AI regulation bill. He gave some specific reasons, and I'm not going to comment on whether or not I agree with those reasons or what anyone else says about those reasons or, anything else. But we will cover the reasons that he gave, and I'll reflect on that a little bit. And that will dovetail with the second part of the video, which will be talking about kind of my ongoing efforts in researching AI safety. So for those who are not aware, I'm a guest at Clemson University. I'm not a lecturer or a teacher or anything, but I am collaborating with the HAIE, that's the Human AI Empowerment Lab at Clemson University. So I'll give you a brief update on that. And then finally, we'll talk about the question whether or not AI will ever fully surpass humans in terms of cognitive horizons or cognitive plateaus. Basically, answer the question of whether or not it's possible that artificial intelligence can think thoughts that humans just can't possibly comprehend. And so, let's get into it. So first up, Gavin Newsom vetoed Senate Bill 1047, and there are a few, there's like kind of 5 primary points. So the first point is that he said it would create a false sense of security. He said that the legislation could give the public a false sense of security about controlling this fast-moving technology. So he was not convinced that Senate Bill 1047 was even up to mustard. It was not up to snuff to do what they wanted it to do. Next is he said, and this is really interesting. This point kind of caught me by surprise. He said, lack of nuance. The bill does not take into account whether an AI system is deployed in high-risk environments, involves critical decision-making, or the use of sensitive data. And so that is basically that lack of nuance, that very heavy-handed approach to AI regulation is actually very typical of the AI safety community, which we'll talk about in a minute. So this I thought was a very interesting development. Next, he said it was overly broad in its application. He said, instead, the bill applies stringent standards to even the most basic functions so long as a large system deploys it. Now, to provide a little bit of context here, there were exceptions for small models, but the problem is basically the legislation targeted large models, increasingly larger models, with the assumption that would only hinder the largest shops like Google and Microsoft. But what a lot of people have pointed out is that smaller models can be just as dangerous and often sometimes are more dangerous because smaller models can be open source and shared. And they can also be purpose-built to do things like, I don't know, write viruses or spread misinformation. And so the model size is not necessarily correlated to its danger. And in fact, there's a pretty good argument to be made that larger models are less dangerous because most people don't have a $100 million data center to run them. Okay, so that's my editorializing of that overly broad application criticism. Point number 4 is that it's an inappropriate approach. His words that were, I do not believe this is the best approach to protecting the public from real threats posed by the technology. He didn't really elaborate further, but that's kind of, I guess, his own editorializing is just saying this is not the right way. And then finally, and what I think is most important, he said that AI regulation needs to be based on empirical evidence and science. So those 5 points are: number 1, false sense of security; number 2, lack of nuance; number 3, overly broad application; number 4, inappropriate approach; and number 5, need for empirical evidence. So again, whether you agree with the specifics or particulars of the regulation, I have a lot of friends in AI safety that were in favor of it. Now, what I will say though is, and this kind of, let's go ahead and just jump off to the conversation about the conversation about the AI safety conversation. So I was working on an incredibly salty Substack post about this, and I'll just tell you the title, and you can kind of figure out where we're going with this. So the title of this post, which this podcast supplants this post, so thank you, Gavin Newsom, for giving me some fodder to talk about. But the title of the article that I was working on says, "Wanted AI safety researchers, no experience required." And so the long story short is that there are a lot of people in AI safety that, in my opinion, don't belong in AI safety. Now, you might know me as a YouTuber and a podcaster and a blogger, but what I need to tell you is that my IT career, my technology career, started in 2007. I was in infrastructure, automation, and engineering. Put it this way, if Skynet were to attack your data center, you'd want me on that call. That was my area of specialization, which is best practices, large scale deployment, hardening systems, maintaining high degrees of uptime, and working across every stack of technology. So it's data, servers, cybersecurity, application, everything. I was infrastructure automation or infrastructure and automation. So I touched every bit of the organization, from email down. And then since 2020, so the last 4 years, I've been branching out and specializing in artificial intelligence. I started aligning AI with GPT-2 and then GPT-3 and now GPT-4. And of course, it is also, the environment has proliferated and OpenAI is not the only player in town. So that was what I was going to write. And the inciting incident for this was an encounter that we had with a potential, or let's just say a group of self-described AI safety researchers. And I'll leave it at that. In my estimation, none of the people that we were talking to in this particular group are qualified to be AI researchers, let alone AI safety researchers. I'm not going to get into their specific qualifications, but put it this way, they don't hold a candle to like my experience, and I don't even have a PhD. And by the way, a bunch of the people that we were talking to also didn't have PhDs, so we're in the same boat there. But when you look at the fact that I have the last 16 plus years in technology and the last 4 in artificial intelligence, I'm a little bit more qualified. Okay, I'm tooting my own horn. So let me just read one of the responses that we got from one of these so-called AI safety researchers. So this is someone who's an insider of the, quote, AI safety community. He said, "I am actually resonating with David's concerns about the AI safety community's lack of emphasis on ensuring our models of risk correspond with how the world empirically works. The notion of having empirically sound premises and being careful not to weasel in vague reasoning jumps is important. The biggest critique of AI safety there would be a tendency towards toy model-like arguments that just skip over relevant aspects of how the world works. Internal consistency using high explanatory, power roughly feels right premises over ensuring comprehensiveness of correspondences with how the world empirically works. For example, the vast majority of AI safety research just assumes away complexity science and algorithmic complexity as applicable in real life." So long story short, the AI safety community is discovering the hard way the need for empiricism and science. This should have been obvious, but this is kind of what I've been talking about with many of my blog posts here on Substack, which if you're only listening, then of course you won't have read some of the longer posts. But I have written several posts about how many people in the AI safety community are basically just kind of raising their hand saying, me too, I'm an AI safety researcher as well. That blog post was entitled "The Shills and Charlatans of AI Safety," where basically people who have no business, no qualifications, no credentials, no relevant experience or skills in AI safety are basically standing up and saying, I'm an AI researcher. All you need to be an AI safety researcher today is apparently an internet connection and an opinion. So that is a big problem. And when you look at Gavin's criticism of Senate Bill 1047, false sense of security, lack of nuance, it doesn't take into context whether AI is deployed in high-risk environments or makes critical decisions. He said that the bill applies stringent standards even to the most basic functions, while giving small models a pass, which honestly, I think that giving a small models a pass would be a huge blind spot. So I tend to agree with that. He doesn't believe it's the best approach, but then more importantly, he concluded by saying that that AI regulation and risk needs to be assessed with empirical evidence and science. So we have this 1-2 punch of, and I use scare quotes here. If you could see my hands, scare quotes of this AI safety researcher is kind of waking up to the fact that one of my chief criticisms of the AI safety community is the lack of need for scientific rigor. Instead, what the AI safety community has done up to this point is bank on unfounded postulates. And so what I mean by an unfounded postulate is people like Nick Bostrom, who, by the way, is a philosopher. He's not a technologist. He's not a programmer. He's not an ethicist. He's came up with some postulates years ago without doing any experiments, without any publishing any peer-reviewed work, without even proposing a real hypothesis. And some of those hypotheses that he's talked about are instrumental convergence and a few other things. And so the AI safety community takes the word of people like Nick Bostrom and Eliezer Yudkowsky as solid gold. And even worse is that basically to them, epistemic grounding, if it comes from Les Wrong or Nick Bostrom, they consider that equally as valid as peer-reviewed, reproducible research. And that is a problem. I mean, I guess there's not really much else to say on the topic, but kind of to kind of put a pin in this, the way that I framed this blog post that I'm just telling you about now is the AI safety community has imagined its own dragon to slay, invented the rules, and is masquerading as legitimate science. This has to stop. Gavin Newsom, so the reason that I am connecting these two dots is because I am seeing firsthand, as someone who is legitimately part of the AI safety community, I'm seeing a lot of charlatans say, I am part of the AI safety community and pushing pseudoscience. And I'm not beating around the bush anymore. I'm saying these are shills. They are charlatans. They are pushing pseudoscience. They are not scientifically literate, and they are creating their own narrative. In fact, there was a post by Noam Brown, of all people, from OpenAI, who, because OpenAI is under increasing criticism for saying, well, we're still doing science, we're still doing research, but at the same time, Noam Brown is saying, well, this is literally his tweet. Let me just read it to you. So Noam Brown from OpenAI, he said, this was in criticism from Jan LeCun, of all people, saying that, like, you're not actually producing science. All you're doing is producing blog posts, which, by the way, I can produce blog posts. I can document my research and say, pay no attention to the man behind the curtains. So if OpenAI's blog posts are legitimate science, then so is mine. And again, this is where the conversation about what actually counts as science and legitimate is one thing. Or maybe those are two separate things. So anyways, Jan LeCun said, a blog post does not come close to meeting the standards of reproducibility, methodology, acknowledgement of prior work, and fair comparison to the state of the art. I agree with Jan here. I don't always agree with Jan. He's often kind of off in la-la land, but in this case, I do agree with his criticism of OpenAI. Noam responded, I think it's the opposite. A lot of published research is frankly BS. Authors just need to delude 3 reviewers and an AC. When releasing something that millions of people use, you can't just delude yourself, a boss, and the product people. People will decide for themselves. So Noam is basically saying the fact that millions of people use our models, that is enough for qualifying as we're doing quote-unquote real science and quote-unquote real research. Now, internally, OpenAI very well could be doing real science and real research, but they're not publishing anything. I reposted this and basically said, let us know when you start publishing actual papers, actual conferences, when you start publishing actual data and actual models again, so that we can all actually scrutinize your work. Of course, that didn't get a response. So we have this, and another thing that I kind of said was, when you disregard the actual scientific establishment, when you disregard the actual process of science and invent your own narrative, you've completely lost the plot. So we have OpenAI on one hand being anti-science, then we have the AI safety community also being anti-science. Meanwhile, people like me and others like me and Gavin Newsom are saying, actually, science matters. Empirical evidence matters. So that's kind of my soapbox spiel for the day. And where we'll end, or where we'll transition to for the last part, is let's talk about cognitive horizons. So there is a frequent kind of again, this goes to anti-scientific kind of just vibe checks, is a lot of people say, oh, you imagine that you'll be able to comprehend what AGI is thinking. You imagine you're banking on the idea that it won't supersede your IQ by 1,000,000-fold and it will be able to think things that you can't possibly think. Well, actually, yeah, there's a good reason to think that AGI will always be comprehensible, even if it's faster than us. Now, when I say comprehensible, I don't mean comprehensible to someone with an average IQ of 90 to 110. However, within the study of intelligence, there's a concept called cognitive plateauing. So a cognitive plateau is, let me bring up the definition real quick, or the description rather. A cognitive plateau is the idea that beyond a certain point, increases in IQ may not necessarily translate to proportional gains in cognitive abilities or real-world outcomes. This concept aligns with some research findings and so on and so forth, but basically it comes down to a few points. So number one is diminishing returns. Research has suggested that the relationship between IQ and various measures of success, such as academic achievement, career performance, and income, show diminishing returns at higher levels of IQ, meaning that just because you're smarter doesn't mean you're actually more effective in the real world. And this is important because the real world is the empirical world. What are the actual results? And then there's number two is a threshold effect. So the threshold effect is that studies show that having an IQ above a certain level, around 120 to 130, is sufficient for success in most fields. Consider that most theoretical physicists have an IQ of 130. It's actually like 128 or something like that. So theoretical physicists, the people who understand things like, theory of relativity and conduct experiments on, gravity waves, you don't need an IQ of 160 or 200 to participate in that. Now, yes, every now and then there's someone with an IQ of 180 out there who's just a genius when it comes to math and physics. But when you look at that ability, it doesn't necessarily translate to effective real-world impacts. And we live in the real world. So AGI, even if it is faster than us, it's not necessarily going to have cognitive abilities that we don't have. So there's the cognitive plateau is that threshold effect. And then another way of looking at this is cognitive horizons. So your cognitive horizon is the total sphere of those things that your brain is capable of grasping. So that is stuff that you are able to grok. Those are mental representations that you are able to construct and mental representations that you are able to manipulate. And not just construct and manipulate, but then can actually also be applied to the real world. So this is one of the things that my research has touched on. I haven't written anything quite extensive about it yet, but the idea is that we are all constrained by the real world. So whatever is going on in your imagination, whatever is going on in the imagination of AGI or whatever else, none of it matters unless it produces real measurable impacts on the real physical world. And the fact that, not to toot my own horn, but my IQ has been measured and it is above that cognitive threshold, that threshold effect. So yeah, like anything I set my mind to, I can generally figure it out and learn it if I want to. But beyond a certain point, it doesn't really matter unless I actually have empirical, objective, measurable impacts on the world, on the economy, on the planet, on you, on other people. Now you might say, okay, well, there's also evidence that people that are highly gifted are able to do great harms. And I will agree with that some of the most destructive people in history have also been very high IQ. That's a conversation for a different story. The entire point of this is I want to challenge the idea that AGI will be able to, quote, think thoughts that humans cannot think. So I call it diminishing returns or intelligence optimum, which is basically just because you can have a gigantic abstraction in your brain doesn't mean that it's useful. And so those diminishing returns on increased intelligence, that definitely exists. Now, will AGI be able to go faster than us? Sure, but it's still going to be constrained by things like time. I mean the physical, passage of time. It takes time to do things. It takes time to build chips. It takes time to build data centers. It takes time to move data. There's also other constraints such as entropy, biospheres. There's all kinds of constraints out there that will slow down whatever it is that you want to achieve. And so eventually your brain can be going 1,000,000 miles an hour on a treadmill, but if each time step that happens in the real world is much, much slower, then that additional thinking time is just wasted energy. And so that is kind of where I'll wrap it up today, which is I really want to push back on this idea that AI will have this. It is magical thinking, and it is an assumption that AI will one day have thoughts that humans just can't comprehend. I'm reminded of that scene from Mass Effect when you first encounter Sovereign, where it's like, you are a low species, and you cannot comprehend what we think, and blah blah blah. Like it's easy for Westerners to imagine thoughts that we can't understand because that is a tradition in Judeo-Christianity. So that's called theosophy, which is like trying to understand the mind of God. But then it's like, oh, well, we have this long tradition of imagining an ineffable being. But there's not really any evidence that there are in the real world ineffable beings. So AGI is not ineffable. Stop giving it these godlike abilities until the evidence says otherwise. The end.